What's up, y'all? Welcome back to the channel. Let's get right into it. Recently, there's been a lot of chatter concerning banks failures, banks closing things, banks having job layoffs, all that good stuff. I want to jump into the reasons why, because like I said, I've been hearing everybody talk about the issues going on with the banks, but not necessarily the cause. Real briefly, I want to pull up the cause, what I think is going on, a timeline of the cause and effects, and a brief, I guess you could say, strategy of what I plan to do to hedge my risk in the upcoming situations that I see presenting themselves. So the real reason that I think banks are currently crashing, failing, and laying off people is because of the Basel III implementations. If you don't know, and I'm probably going to do a video on it at some point, and I've mentioned it throughout my videos in the past, the Basel III is a meeting of a specific committee within the Bank of International Settlements. It's kind of like the bank of all banks, the bank of national banks, to say. So there's not like a U.S. thing that's between all nations. It's more so of a global bank. This bank has a committee that meets anytime there's any type of, I guess you could say, global crisis or financial crisis. They like to meet and set up terms how they can address the crisis. From my understanding, there have been three meetings of the Bank of International Settlements Basel Committee. They meet in Basel, Switzerland. The third meeting happened as a result, or more so as a response to the great financial crisis in 2006, 2007, 2008. Being that banks weren't as liquid as they should have been, and being that they had too much risk, International Bank of Settlement basically wanted to come up with a plan to see how to reduce the risk in banks and increase the amount of liquidity that banks have. And by liquidity, I just mean the amount of money that they can actually give out. They can actually give that money out if it's required. All right, so I just kind of briefly went over, in my opinion, what Basel III does, but these are the pillars that kind of describe what Basel III does. Enhance minimum capital and liquidity. Like I said, they want to increase the liquidity in the banks. Enhance supervisory review, the supervisory review process for firm-wide risk management, basically to reduce the risk, as I just mentioned. Also to enhance risk disclosure and market discipline. Basically make sure that the banks are doing what they're supposed to be doing. So I found this article on EFG International. It's kind of summarizing where I want to go with this topic. It's an article written by, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Gianluigi Mandruzada. All right, in this article, he mentioned some of the things that I found to be the biggest reason for the issues with the banks. So first off, under Basel III, gold is classified as a tier one asset, meaning that it's basically a risk-less asset alongside the US dollar, US Treasury, things like that. It also classified unallocated gold, such as paper gold that's traded in derivative markets, as a third tier asset. Under Basel III, they're also getting rid of third tier assets or third tier capital. So technically, banks aren't supposed to really be having third tier capital the way that they did in the past. They're going to be shifting that. Like I said, they're trying to get rid of it altogether. As of right now, banks are required to have an 85%. Let me highlight this here. Required stabling fund, and by this, they basically mean, let's say, if a bank has something that's unstable, unallocated, or some type of bad debt, that for every 15% of that bad debt or potentially risky debt that they must have another 85% of stable assets on their balance sheet. And those stable assets can be tier one assets such as gold or dollars, US Treasury bills, things like that. All right, so moving forward with that timeline that I mentioned earlier, Basel III was done as a response to the great financial crisis of 2007 to, you could technically say, '06 through 2012. But they basically had a meeting, I think it was done in 2012, and everything that I just mentioned, as far as the regulations that were defined during that meeting, they were set to be in place by January 1st of 2023, at least for here in the United States. They're supposed to be set in place by January 1st of 2023. This is the timeline where I feel like the banks actually begin their downfall, begin their issues, because Basel III, which is now requiring banks to have 85% stable assets for every 15% of non-stable assets that they have. I think banks that don't actually have the proper assets, the effects of them not having those proper assets are starting to show up, and it's that's actually what's causing the banks to actually go down. Before I get further into this timeline, I also want to explain something else. Imagine if you have a group of 10 people. The 10 people are labeled person one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, nine, 10. Person one owes two, person two owes three, person three owes four. And they just say a certain amount, $10. Each of those people owe the next person, person 10 owes person one. So technically, if it's $10 that each person owes each person $10, technically you can just altogether cancel everything out. And that's how the United States banking system works. Different banks can borrow from each other. Different banks can borrow from the Federal Reserve. If they need the funds, they can pull from this. If they need any type of liquidity to back up the assets that they have if something goes wrong, they can pull from other banks. The issue, using the analogy that I just mentioned, imagine if of those 10 people who all owe each other $10, if one person actually does not have the assets to pay the next person. At that point, even though everyone else could potentially have their assets, it's going to throw a debt loop into that system, and somebody isn't going to actually get paid their money because one of the people actually don't have what they said that they were supposed to have, and that's what I think is going to happen in the banking system due to this Basel III that was kicked off on January 1st. All right, so after January 1st, Basel III being kicked off, around March of 2023, which is 3 months later, we started to see major banks begin to fall. We saw Signature Bank, we saw Silicon Valley Bank, and if I'm not mistaken, let me check. On March 15th, we saw Credit Suisse Bank basically go under. Do keep in mind that these are banks in the United States. Credit Suisse is a bank that's a Swedish bank. So it's completely out of the United States system. I'm going to get back to that in just a second. That was in March. Um, on March 12th, the Federal Reserve created the Bank Term Funding Program, which basically was a program to bail out any other banks that would have been falling during this time. They also did not come out with a list of any of the banks that they were actually helping. So it's widely believed that other banks were supposed to be falling after March 12th, but due to the Federal Reserve stepping in to save these banks, they have not failed, and nobody knows actually who these banks are, how many banks are actually on the verge of failing, being that it's kind of, I guess you can say, being covered up. But moving back to the timeline, in August 8th of 2023, Moody's, which is one of the huge rating systems, one of the big three rating systems when it comes to banks and things like that, they basically downgraded the United States banks, and what's interesting to me was the reason. Moody's cut the credit rating of small to mid U.S. banks. And when they did this downgrade, they warned that the sector's strength will likely be tested by funding risk and weaker profitability. What interests me right here is when they talked about the funding risk, because how would they know that there's other funding risks coming unless those risks have already been established, which kind of was done through the Basel III. The banks that Moody's cut the rating for included Bank of New York Mellon, U.S. Bank Corp, State Street, Truist Bank. Let's see what else. What we have. The agency also changed its outlook to negative for 11 major lenders, including Capital One, Citizens Financial, Fifth Third Bancorp. So there's a lot of other banks that Moody's is also giving a warning about, saying that they could potentially be downgraded. And I personally believe that all this is a result of what's going on with the Basel III Accord. More recently, and I've been following this bank for about a year now, but more recently, I've been noticing and hearing about issues going on with Deutsche Bank, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing it correctly. Deutsche Bank, which is a German bank, they're now laying off 3,500 people. And me hearing about those recent layoffs, I just did a quick Google search to hear more about bank layoffs, and I found that not only was Deutsche Bank laying off $3,500. Not only are they laying off 3,500 people, I see that Citigroup is cutting 20,000 jobs, and other banks are also doing a whole bunch of layoffs right now. So, being that all these banks are doing layoffs, and these are not just U.S. banks, being that this is being done on a national level, and so much of it is happening at one time, I guess directed, or the main issue kind of being cited as the bank not having enough liquidity or having too much risk, which is the main thing that the Basel III Accord was on. So with that being said, I think that banks are simply falling right now due to the effects of the Basel III that's kicking in. I think we're going to have a lot of more banks to fall. All the banks that have bad loans, bad debts, bad equity, and made bad investments. All the mal investments are basically going to start showing up, and a lot of these banks are going to go down. I wouldn't be surprised if we see larger banks such as JP Morgan with Jamie Dimon and everything coming in to swallow up all the banks that took on the bad debt and that aren't able to actually back up the assets that they have. My response to this is basically going to be to follow what the Basel III Accord is stating. Same way that they're saying that banks should get rid of bad investments and focus more on stable investments such as gold and things like that. I think that individual people should be also focusing on stable assets and trying to get everything a nice foundation plan while all this stuff is crashing down. I think there's going to be a lot of deals in the markets. Of course, none of this is financial advice or anything like that. I personally will probably be buying some gold or gold stocks in the short term. Hopefully, I can get some deals on that right now. If the price goes up, I can swap it for real estate or buy some of these equities once this banking crisis or recession and whatever else comes with it is all over with. With that being said, I do appreciate you guys for watching the channel. If you already haven't, make sure you subscribe. If you enjoyed what you saw in this video, make sure you hit the like button. If you have any comments, any questions, make sure you list it down below. I do try to reach out to everybody. With that being said, I'll catch you guys in the next video. I'm out.